It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. What's up? What's happening? That's Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. Thanks for joining us again. If you like the show, make sure that you hit like if you're watching it on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you are watching or listening right now as Logan and I dive into the coaches in the NFC East today, the coaching edition of the show, Logan. We've been doing our positional rankings. We got the offense down last week. We got the defense down earlier this week. And so today, we're actually not going to rank head coaches. We're going to talk about head coaches later in the show, but we are going to rank offensive and defensive coordinators, and then we'll talk about why we are not ranking the head coaches. So, Logan, you want to start with offense? You want to start with defense? Because there's some really interesting guys on both sides of the ball in this division.
Yeah, I mean, I have an offensive bias, so I think, and I think it's fair now. That used to be like an offensive player bias, but now I think this league is so offensive driven. Like that is like the most important side of the football, and I do think you're getting some really cool defensive innovation, but really like your team goes as your offense goes. So I think maybe we hit on that. I don't know. It's up to you.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting because if I'm looking at this correctly, there is one coach in the division who you played for, and it's actually one of the defensive coordinators.
Yes.
However, I do agree with you that the offense, I mean, they're the ones that dictate. You have the football. And we talk a lot about how defenses can try to flip that on its head and try to dictate to the offense. But ultimately, it's the offense that is making the decisions and the defense that has to react. So let's start on that side of the ball. So in Dallas, you have Brian Schottenheimer, who will not be calling plays. Mike McCarthy will be. You have Brian Johnson in Philadelphia. You have, obviously, Bieniemy here in Washington. Then you have Mike Kafka and kind of Brian Dable, who obviously has a very heavy influence in New York. Simple enough. Where do we start if we're saying who are the best guys? This is actually hard because a lot of these guys haven't been doing this in their current roles for very long. EB, obviously, with Andy Reid and KC. Schottenheimer's been in the league forever. But for Johnson and Kafka, like younger guys in the league.
Yeah. So I think I would say, like, again, I'm going to go back to like experience, and if I'm going best offensive coordinator / head coach in the division, it's probably Kafka and Daboll. Like just what they did last year was kind of what Sirianni did, like Jalen Hurts' first or second year. Like they both those guys working together created an offense that elevated personnel, that allowed Daniel Jones to, maybe not be the best quarterback in the division, but at least be a guy that you're like, now you have to pay him. And I think that's good. And they seem very confident in him. And I really, every game that I watched of the Giants last year, I thought this is a team that's, again, doing some cool stuff schematically. And they're also doing some cool stuff from like a coaching execution detail standpoint. Like there's a reason that you can be so hyper efficient. Like, I think we talked about this. They were a team that really struggled to find big plays, but they won games, being really efficient with their third down, with their 3-step drop stuff, with their quick game, with some screen stuff, finding ways to get Saquon the football. And you aren't as efficient as they were without being hyper detailed. So I think, as kind of lackluster, maybe their total offensive production was last year, like they're not, I think they were like a top 15 offense, maybe top 20 offense, like nothing crazy, but they were able to win football games. And I think that coaching staff deserves a ton of credit, because one of the ways that I grade coaches is like, how good are your offensive players? And then how good are you in terms of getting production out of them? And last year, like we've talked about, their offensive line was not good. Their skill position guys, I think they overperform. But again, like I think you look around the division and say, like, we still think that they're the fourth group in the league, in the division, right? And that's how we felt last year. So for them to take that group and elevate the way they did, I'm like, they have to be the number one. It's weird because it's not just Kafka, it's Kafka and Daboll working together, obviously. But I think both those guys kind of putting their heads together lead to a really good offensive performance.
So I think we should even take a step back and kind of double click on what you just said. Like what is even the rubric here, right?
Yeah.
For me, what makes a good offensive coordinator is someone who understands their personnel, uses it well, and does that within a larger team concept, right? Meaning like you understand that you're playing a long season. You understand that how you play and your efficiency offensively affects the defense. You understand who your playmakers are, and there's a concerted effort to get them the ball, specifically in key moments. You insulate your quarterback, you insulate your offensive line.
Yeah.
Like there's a real understanding. Or, if you're Philadelphia and you have the best offensive line in football, you use that to your advantage. How do you put your players in good spots, give the best players the most challenging stuff that is also the most rewarding, and still get production out of players who are not as talented by creating opportunities for them and leverage those opportunities for your better guys. So it's this big cyclical,
Yeah.
run to set up the pass to set up the run, use your star players as a decoy, but also, setting up something in the first quarter to use in the third quarter. There's like all these things that you could get into examples of, but that's kind of, to me, like the big rubric here is, do you understand who your personnel is? Do you use them wisely? And you do that within the larger team concept of what you're trying to be in terms of an identity as a football team.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think I think this Kafka Dayball collective is elevated by the fact that Philadelphia's offensive coordinators knew. I think if Philadelphia's offensive coordinator had stayed and Sirianni had been the head coach again this year, I think they would probably be number one. Because talk about a team that does that at a super high level with great personnel, it's Philadelphia. Like what they did with Jalen Hurts in terms of really making an offense for him. We've talked about this before. I don't think Jalen Hurts is necessarily a system guy. But, they developed this really innovative RPO system, that was more than just it's kind of like what I was doing, not I was doing, but what Houston was doing in 2019 with Deshaun Watson. It's an RPO with a zone read, kind of this amalgamation of two really challenging concepts for the defenses to handle. And I thought they kind of took it to the next level in the same way that like Kyle in 2012 with the zone read stuff with Robert elevated the zone read stuff to a level that no one had ever seen in the NFL before. I feel like Sirianni and that offensive staff last year did the same thing. And so if they had been here, if I forget the gentleman's name.
Shane Steichen. He's now in Indy. Yeah.
Yeah. If Shane Steichen had still been here, I would say Philadelphia would probably be number one, right? Just because of what they did going to the Super Bowl week in, week out, the quarterback sneak stuff they did, like the run stuff they do with the quarterback and the detail again, which they kind of install an approach, they'd be number one, but they're gone. So to me, Kafka's the next group, and a little bit because they're kind of the low definition version of that, right? They, again, very innovative with the pen in terms of putting their guys in good positions to be successful. But I think the other thing that you didn't necessarily mention in your rubric is the detail.
Yeah,
right?
That was the thing I forgot for sure.
Is the detail that they're coaching it with, like the splits, the precision, the timing, the trust between the quarterback and the receivers, again, the layering of plays is a huge element. And so, I remember last year doing some breakdowns, like for some of my clients, like watching, like, hey, in this formation, like they're 90% whatever. And you look for those tells and you watch a lot of film and you're grinding the tape. And I just was like, man, they do such a good job of right when you think you have something on them, they have a variation off of it. And so they deserve a ton of credit. And so to me, they're number one because I think they're the best coordinator that is still around, right? Like everyone else is kind of in flux and up, but I think they would probably have been number two if Philly staff had stayed. So I'm really excited about what they're doing. And I think for me, the second group now is a guy that I think I'm probably a little bit biased towards, but it's Eric Bieniemy. Like, I think again, we've seen him. You and I have been to practices. We've seen the detail. We've seen some of the things that get you excited about offensive play callers, right? And again, it's so like this. I think you sent me this, Craig. It was like basically saying like everyone runs the same stuff. Yes. The thing that separates a good coordinator from a bad coordinator is kind of that feel, that je ne sais quoi, that magic that they bring. But also the thing that separates is the detail that they bring in practice. And EB has been incredibly detailed, and he makes the concepts through the details come to life in a way that gets me excited because it reminds me of Sean, or reminds me of Kyle, or reminds me of these really innovative offensive minds that I've played with. And so to me, it has to be EB at number two. And again, we're biased because we've seen it. Maybe I would feel the same way about Shane Steichen and Mike McCarthy. I doubt it, but maybe I would if I was watching their practice every day. But EB has just been that good during the OTA minicamp period, and I can't wait to see what he brings for training camp.
Yeah, for sure. I think that detail, to flesh that out a little bit, like this is a league of inches and
Yeah.
yards. And like, that's something that really hit me when I was covering the team and I started to really watch a lot more tape is like, you'd watch the end zone angle of a crossing route and you realize every single time that ball is going 1 inch over a defensive lineman's
Yeah.
outstretched arm. And it is, in a yard wide window through two linebackers. And like, that's every slant, every crossing route, everything. Every screenplay is that close to
Yeah.
being a pick six the other way. Like, so the details of timing, the details of splits, the details of breaking at 9 yards versus 10, like those things matter and are a 1 yard difference either between like good or great of having a yard of separation that you can run away or getting tackled on the catch, or 1 yard the other way of a pick six or an incompletion. And like that level of detail is required for the highest level of offense. And obviously Eric's done this in Kansas City with extremely talented skill players and Patrick Mahomes, who makes yards appear out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that attention to detail is 100% right. And we saw how that, kind of pristine accuracy and execution can elevate even inferior skill guys in New York last
Yeah.
year with what
Mm-hmm.
Dayball does, with what Kafka does. And with Dayball, like if you want to throw it back to where was he before, he was in Buffalo with
Yeah.
elevated skill guys, and they have one of the best offenses in football.
And
And
he
so you
elevated Allen,
see,
though. Yeah,
yeah,
like to your point.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you see it, right? You see the impact it has. If you have good players or great players, it gets the most out of them. If you have average players, let's call them, you can win with them because you have that level of detail. And I think you're 100% right that Eric Bieniemy has that style and attention to detail in coaching. And I think with Rivera, he has been given the leeway to run things exactly how he wants to ensure that gets across to the players. And I think, obviously they have the skill talent to get here. Brian Johnson, that said, the offensive coordinator now in Philadelphia, was the quarterback's coach last
Right.
year. And in Philly, we saw that same detail. I mean, Steichen obviously was a huge part of it. He was the OC. He got a head coaching job at a fairly young age, and was clearly impressive in interviews. To do that, he was coveted not just in Indy, but in other places. But because we haven't seen it yet, I tend to agree with you that even though EB is doing it for the first time without Andy Reid as an OC, I'd probably put Bieniemy second.
Yeah, and I think the thing, with Brian Johnson that kind of, and again, this is this is my own bias, I think a little bit, is when I've been part of teams who've hired in house, they haven't they've said we want to keep the same offense, we're going to hire in house. They don't always hire the best guy. Now, I will say Brian Johnson's resume is very good. He's been OC at the college level before. He's been a quarterback coach. Those are all really high things that I think are very, very valuable. But sometimes you're saying, oh, we want to just keep some continuity. We're not hiring the guy that's bringing that EB level of detail. We're not making sure we retain Sean McVay when a new coaching staff comes in. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a level of detail and a level of, there's something about a good OC, man. Like I'm thinking back on my career. One of the best guys that I played for is someone that you probably never heard of is what's his name? Kelly in Houston. And he had this obsession, but he wasn't like a grinder. The head coach at the time, he was in New England for a long time.
Romeo Crennel.
No, that's the defensive coordinator. He's a new OC.
Bill O'Brien.
Bill O'Brien. He was psychotic with the details.
Yes.
Psychotic. And so it allowed Kelly to be like this super detailed, really great communicator in the field room. And then Bill O'Brien was in there just grinding just like, hey, this isn't good enough. And the offense was really good. It was excellent when he was there. So I just think like sometimes you need to have that strong hand, and maybe Sirianni's that guy that kind of makes sure the detail stays there. Everyone says Brian Johnson's a great communicator. He's got the chops to be a good OC, but you need someone that's a little bit obsessive, a little bit, compulsive. Like that's how Kyle was, man. Kyle was super compulsive. I think that's one of the reasons why that staff is so successful is because everyone got that kind of like every detail matters when you're coaching it. And so, again, we don't know. I don't know that much about Brian Johnson, their OTAs. I have a client that's down there. We talked a little bit about their OTA period. It was very, very, very vanilla, kind of very veteran savvy, very, very veteran friendly, which makes sense. They just won the Super Bowl, right? Like, take care of your old guys. So they haven't shown a lot. They haven't done a lot. But I do think that his pedigree is one that makes you say, if anyone's going to be okay with the personnel they've got, with the head coaching, with an offensive head coach who's still kind of in the fold there, they're going to be okay. So I'd say we're going to put him third, but he could very easily be, first or second, depending on how things go. Maybe you disagree, Craig. I don't know.
No, I don't disagree with that. And shout out to Tim Kelly, who's the
Tim
OC
Kelly. Good job, Tim.
Excellent. He was initially hired, I think, as a quality control guy.
Yeah,
and worked his way all the way up to OC.
Just grounded out, man. He's good. He was a really good coach. Really good coach.
So that leaves Brian Schottenheimer, which is interesting because Schottenheimer's the most experienced by far.
Yeah.
Like he's been coaching in the NFL since some of these guys. I mean, EB maybe was coaching by then, but I think EB was still playing. Kafka's like my age.
Yeah.
I think he was at Northwestern when I was at Syracuse. He was playing.
Oh, really?
I was not. And then Brian Johnson was actually a freshman at Utah when Alex Smith was the Heisman Trophy winner.
Oh, wow.
So 2004, I believe, is when that was. So Schottenheimer started as a coach for the St. Louis Rams as an assistant in 1997. He's actually been in Washington. He was here in 2001 as the quarterback's coach. He was the OC most famously in the Rex Ryan, like New York, Mark Sanchez teams, 06 to 2011. He was an OC in St. Louis for the Rams before going back to college and then making his way back to the NFL, mostly as a quarterback's coach, but he was the OC in Seattle as well, 2018 to 2020. So last year with the Cowboys as an analyst, now they're OC. He does not have play calling responsibilities, but a guy that I don't know, man, like a little bit of Scott Turner vibes, obviously, with his dad being a former head coach, Marty, legendary NFL head coach, been around the game forever as a coach, but has never been around. I'll just say this. He's been a part of a lot of really good teams. A lot of them were defensive head coaches whose defenses carried them while the offense plodded along, whether that was New York with Sanchez, Seattle, and those teams, etc.
Yeah, and I think, there's a skill in that. There's a skill in understanding that you need to rely on the defensive side of the ball. And I think the reason that I'm not that high on him, and I think we are not that high on him in this situation, is partially because of the stuff that McCarthy has said, right? McCarthy said, I want to run the football more. I want to rely on the defense more. And I think there is some merit to that philosophy, but you need to keep innovating offensively, right? You can't take this back 20 years and be like, hey, let's just stick with what we want to do. And I feel like this hire, and I don't know that much about Schottenheimer as a coach. I really don't. Like, I'm sure he's a really bright dude. You aren't in the NFL for as long as he's been in the NFL and not know a lot about football. I think the thing about the hire is it feels like a safe hire, someone that McCarthy knows he can have a lot of like governance over and is going to do what he says. He's not going to like rock the boat and try to be overly innovative offensively like Kellen Moore was, right? Like that was one of the big headbutting issues there, is that Kellen Moore was trying to do all this crazy offensively innovative stuff, which I would kind of push back against anyway. I thought he was doing what they needed to do to win football games. And so the fact that Mike McCarthy...
He was the most coveted OC on the market the second he got fired in Dallas.
Yeah, and so the fact that McCarthy was like, we don't want that here. I want someone that's going to let me, going to insulate me, going to do what I want to do, is just, to me, is never a good reason to hire somebody. And again, he might be the smartest dude in the room, but the reason you make that hire is because he's doing what you want as Mike McCarthy. So how smart is Mike McCarthy, and what does Mike McCarthy want to do? And Mike McCarthy said he wants to run the football more. And I get it. I understand the value there of running the football more. But this, in the NFL today, you can't just line up and run the football the way that you used to, right? It just, the game flow is so different. You can't leverage your defense like that. One of the reasons that defense was good is because they can play with a lead. They can rush the passer. Like, think about that. They're moving Micah Parsons to defensive end, and you're going to say we're going to run the football a ton. You're going to be in a lot of games that are 21 to 24, and you're not going to be able to rush the passer as much as you want, So I just think it's a total kind of miscalculation. And again, I've been wrong, but this is just my bias. Like having been around offensive football, like you never want to go turtle. Never go turtle. Always try to kind of at least stay innovating to some level. Like look at New York last year. No one would have faulted them at all if they were like, hey, we're going to run the ball 40 times a game because we don't trust our quarterback. They found other ways to kind of be innovative with that limited offensive structure. And I think that's what McCarthy wants, but I'm not sure that he has the foresight and the staff to support that kind of subtle innovation to kind of help them maintain the football. Now, I might be totally wrong, but that's
I
at
think you're
least
wrong.
what
That's the reputation.
that's what that feels like right now.
Yeah, that's the reputation. McCarthy in Green Bay was like this, and it kind of worked in a way because Rodgers apparently is someone who likes things pretty plain and vanilla and just is going to rely on the fact that he's Aaron freaking Rodgers and his vision and his ability to read a defense and his arm strength would just give me the plain stuff, I'll go execute.
Which is so frustrating because look how good he was when Matt LaFleur was there.
And but you heard that there was friction because Matt would be like, no. And it's like when Kyle got to Atlanta, and we talked about it with Matt Ryan, that and you've told the stories on the show. Like Kyle was like, no, Matt, we can be better if you just trust me and we do it this way. And eventually, and Matt goes out and wins the MVP. And so I think you look back at how good Rodgers was at that time. They should have won more than one Super Bowl. And I think most people in Green Bay would probably agree with me on that. So I just imagine these closed door sessions last year in McCarthy's office where McCarthy be frustrated and like Schottenheimer would come in there as an analyst and they would just bitch about Kellen Moore's creativity. And now here they are. So I agree with you. And by the way, I don't know that to be happening. That's a figment of my imagination. It just feels very, very plausible. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Like a guy that's been around, knows how to do the job, will be the sounding board that McCarthy wants, not the sounding board that he needs.
Yes,
and
I think that's it. That's the
we'll see how fruitful it is because they are talented. It is a base NFL offense. They will probably have some weeks where they put up a ton of points. But my guess is the Cowboys fans will be very frustrated by this, and it won't last more than a year or two.
I agree. I think, so just to recap, we got the Giants at 1, right?
Yep.
We got Washington at 2 with EB, and then we got Philly. Again, I think that's a sneaky one to me. That could be a much better group. We don't know. It's hard to kind of have a full evaluation. And then I feel pretty good about Dallas being 4th there.
Agreed. I do think that's going to change quite a bit when we flip the field, so let's find out. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. All right, Dallas came in last in our offensive coordinator rankings. However, Logan, I do think they probably come in first with Dan Quinn, who is not just probably the best defensive coordinator in the division. He might be the best defensive coordinator in the league. Yeah. And if you look at the last 10 years of NFL football, I don't know how many guys have a better resume than Dan Quinn, going back to obviously leading those legendary Seattle defenses to multiple Super Bowls back in the day.
And when you, again, it's so funny because everyone runs cover 3, everyone runs Tampa 2, everyone runs these line stunts that they are really, really good at in pass rushing situations on our first and second down. They just do it better. They just do it with a violence and a speed and a confidence that not a lot of teams, like when you turn on Dallas tape. Now it's not always clean, it is like there's mistakes here and there, but the like when they're rotating to cover 2 out of this weird cover 3 man look and the nickel guys, the Tampa 2 player, and it's just like, and everyone's flying to the spot. The rushers on the games, they're not running into each other. There's not these miscommunications. It's just like high definition stuff. And I think Dan deserves a ton of credit for that. Now, are they always super sound in the back end? No, but a little bit that's the personnel. Like Diggs is going to do what Diggs is going to do. But I think it's just, again, they don't do a ton of overly complicated stuff. They do like they do 3 things. They do them really well. They marry them together really well. They disguise their cover 2 or the Tampa 2s to look like zero man, right? They disguise their zero man to look like cover 3. And so you don't really know. And I remember when they played Washington in the last game, it was like the game that Cole Holcomb had a pick 2 years ago for a touchdown. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Taylor Heineke just had no idea what was going on the whole game, like no idea what was happening. And then it was like they got one big play, and that was like the whole offense for the Commanders. And when you watch Dallas week in and week out, they do a really good job of like having a very detailed rush / blitz package, but also knowing what they do really well and then matching it really well at a high level. So I think that to me, it's easy to say he's number one. I played for Dan. Like, Dan is an awesome human being, an awesome coach, an awesome leader, an awesome motivator. Like, that's another thing he's excellent at. He's good at building like a culture and getting guys to buy in at a super high level. And I love Dan Quinn, so that's like an easy pick for me. But I think also, despite my personal relationship with him, like the film supports what he's doing.
Yeah. So I think when you look at like kind of the rubric, if we take the same step back that we took after, looking at what makes the best offensive coordinator in the division, we take like what makes good, what makes Dan Quinn great. And, okay, that's kind of the rubric. It's some of the same stuff, right? Like, do you understand who your personnel is? Do you play to your strengths? Do you cover your weaknesses? Like, I think it's even more important on defense to play to strengths, cover weaknesses, and to be ready. And I think that can be both schematically and personnel wise. And that gets to Diggs, right? Like, they let Diggs be Diggs because the upside is worth it. And they put things in place to, like the safeties know that he's going to gamble.
Right.
Like, they're cognizant of that. They're coached up to say like, hey man, Trayvon's going to probably take a couple of risks. Can you try to make sure that you cover for him if he does? Like, you see those things. And so it's going to be interesting this year now that they have Gilmore on the other side, how they play that and how they kind of use this new strength they have. But obviously they've done an incredible job of maximizing Micah Parsons the last couple of years. They've done such a good job of covering for when they've had defensive tackles out and some of the injury issues that they've had. Their linebacker situation has been super messy, and it's hurt them because talent missing hurts. But I think overall they've done a good job of consistently staying in games and being competitive on that side of the ball. And I also think that, we talked about McCarthy's, lackluster creativity.
He's conservative. He's very
that nature. Like, there's a reason that Jerry Jones was fairly desperate to keep Dan Quinn in town. Okay, McCarthy's our guy as the head coach, but like, we want the fire and ice of Dan Quinn as the guy on the other side of the ball that can bring up the room. And so I think that, his, just like Eric Bieniemy's impact is now larger than just his role as offensive coordinator. I think Quinn has that in Dallas, and I think it's, with all due respect to, I think we're looking at 4 good coordinators here. Obviously Sean Desai, we'll talk about at some point in these rankings, has a lot to prove doing it for the first time. But like, we're talking about 4 good coordinators, and I think Dan Quinn is safely number 1, which is saying something about Dan Quinn.
Yeah, safely, it depends. It kind of beauty's in the eye of the beholder, probably. But yeah, I mean, they just did a great job last year. They did a great job on all levels, and I think that's really important. I think that your comparison to EB there is really apt in the sense that like he's a culture guy as much as he is an X's and O's guy. And I think when you get guys again who are bought in, care about what you're doing, they want to play hard for you. I think there's a lot of value there. So, from a scheme standpoint, and I love that he got outside of his comfort zone, man. Like, his bread and butter was this cover 3, very, I guess, kind of vanilla conservative defense, right? Everyone, the Seattle cover 3, right? It was, everyone knew what to do. Like, I could draw it up in my sleep because you saw it so much after they were really good at it in Seattle. It was essentially the same version of like, Tampa 2, when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were running Tampa 2 all the time. Like, they just had the personnel to do it. And so for Dan to kind of say like, this is where I made my money. Like, how do I innovate off of this and kind of come up with a new scheme? I think, again, just deserves a ton of respect. Like, they blitz more now. They're more aggressive in terms of
his adaptation over the years and evolution has been really impressive to watch.
And so like, Dan to me is number 1. And again, he's got a lot of the horses to get that done. I think a lot of people say, well, what about Wink, getting it done with less? I just think there's something about what Dan's doing down there in Dallas that is innovative It's detailed. It's exciting. You can tell the guys are bought in. It'll be interesting how it goes, as the personnel starts to wane, because that's always what happens, like, because you paid your quarterback, you've got money invested elsewhere. But I think last year is a really good indicator for Dan, for sure.
All right, so that leaves Desai in Philly, Jack here in Washington, and then Wink Martindale in New York. Who do you got number 2?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a 2-horse race here, and I think everyone's going to say Wink, and I think probably Wink deserves it given the personnel, but I also think Wink is exciting. He's exciting to talk about. He's like essentially like the most extreme offense you can think of. Like the Texas Tech spread offense version of defense in the NFL. Like, he is doing some stuff that is just not. It's a little outside the box, and I think that is one reason why everyone's like Wink Martindale. But I think Jack deserves a ton of credit, man. He came up with some really excellent game plans. Think about, them versus Philly, them versus Minnesota, and just able to kind of put his guys in good positions. And again, he's got good horses here too, but it's really good in a different way. And I think as much as Jack is kind of this polarizing figure, for stuff that he says, like, he's a smart dude, man. He's a really smart coordinator, and they've been very, very successful. Like, bringing in like Casey Toohill, bringing in James Smith-Williams, guys and then not losing a beat, like the evolution of Jamin Davis, like knowing when to push on players and when to pull back, like the innovative stuff they're doing with nickel and dime coverages, the way they utilize Cam Curl, the Cinco front, all that kind of stuff, man. It's impressive. And I look at like what they did against the 49ers, for example, and they did a great job against the 49ers outside of like 2 plays.
Right.
The offense wasn't doing anything in that game. So
right.
I think Jack deserves a ton of credit. It's a little bit more traditional, I guess, in his approach when you're comparing it to Wink. But I really think it's like kind of either or, and kind of whatever you're thinking about. And the only reason I might give the edge to Wink is just because they had not a lot of talent in the back end. And he was like, we're going to do this hyper aggressive blitz scheme with guys that aren't very good. I don't want to say they're not good, because I think they played well. But I'm going to find a way to coach those guys up and do what I want to do and play this kind of high leverage defense that not only elevates our defense, but also elevates the team and our offense. So I think it really just depends, because I think they're both excellent. So
yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to split hairs here, because you're ranking 2 very different guys. Like you said, Jack, polarizing for reasons that have nothing to do with football.
Yeah.
I've talked about those on the radio before. That's a different show, different segment.
Yeah.
But like, as a coordinator, as a personnel manager, what he did last year was really impressive. And by the way, he did it under fire, and it was a fire that he set under his own seat with the things that he said. And then, off the field, he said, and then the Jamin Davis stuff, when he kind of lit Jamin up in the press, and you're going, what are you doing, man? Like, are you trying? Like, literally, it felt like he was trying to get fired. But, when it came to the Jamin stuff, he was right. Or at least it worked, whether it would have worked anyway. And that actually wasn't the best approach. That's the kind of, what's that called? Not a false, it's just it's an alternate universe that we'll never know. But clearly, A to B, it worked. And I think the other thing too, and talking to guys like Montez, and, you listen to John, and like these guys respect Jack and the positions that he puts them in, and how he uses them. I think you're 100% dead on too with, the nickel and dime coverages that they use, and how they've utilized a guy like Cam Curl and this Buffalo nickel stuff. They just figured out how to utilize the personnel that they had, which also, by the way, not an accident. I don't think that it matches the way a lot of modern offenses are running. Like, we need to get more speed on the field, but we still need to be solid against the run. How do we do it? We invent this Buffalo nickel where we have a bigger safety, and it started with Landon. And then, in a way, it almost started with Landon as a way to get him to play linebacker without calling it linebacker. But you kind of invent this position that as a hybrid of roles, and it works. And then it becomes a part of who you are defensively. So I think Jack's really impressive, but like you said, Wink doing it, like, the question would be, if we're going to rank coordinators, right? And again, this is a hypothetical, but it's the best I got in trying to separate the hairs here. If Jack had Wink's talent and Wink had Jack's talent, who would do better?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's like one of those alternate universes thing, but I think if I was going to say one thing, is Wink seems to have like a superpower, like an elite trait in his blitz packages, like his ability to consistently just break protection schemes, week in and week out, not just of the Commanders. I know I've talked about that a lot with like the Commanders and, the famous Charles Leno double bump, which we've talked about on this show a ton.
Yeah.
But he does it every week. He does it every single week. So to me, I want a guy who's thinking about football that way, who's making blitz packages that way. And I know, that's an element of that Jack has developed, but it's like Wink might be the best in the league at that, and I think having a coordinator like that with the talent on this defensive line. And again, like one of the things, again, Jack deserves a ton of credit for this too. Like he has cultivated an environment from a rush standpoint where it's like, I want you guys to work together as 4 guys rushing cohesively. I'm not going to work this crazy blitz scheme. I'm going to say like, hey, like you communicate with the end. If the end gets high, you're going to do this. If you get high, the end's going to play off of you. And when that works, it's almost unblockable. So they've gotten to it in different ways, partially because he's got maybe the best defensive line in football. I'm talking about Jack. But I think I would probably give the slightest edge to Wink, just the slightest edge. And again, that's team football up there. They're running the football a ton. They're possessing the football at a high level. So they're not leveraging him in quite the same way. But it's just, you don't see that ability to just break protections the way he does that often. And it's not a knock on Jack because I love what he's done here. Again, super innovative. And it's really like a 2A, 2B situation, like kind of depending on what you have and what you need. But I would give the slightest edge because we have to rank it to Wink.
I agree. And we've seen Wink do it, right? When he was in Baltimore, he had elite personnel and they were very, very, very good. Jack, in 2021, that was not great. That year of team football for them. So, but the year before 2020, they finished 5th in the league in defense, obviously making the playoffs as a 7-9 team. So, we've seen it. When you're coached long enough, you're going to have some level of mixed results. Jack's largely been very, very good. Wink's largely been excellent. I would give a slight nod to Wink. We should talk briefly about Sean Desai, who is the young, exciting defensive coordinator in Philly. They really, really like him. He comes off kind of the Vic Fangio tree, which I think is probably, would you say like the Fangio style is become the most common in the league at this point? You got guys obviously like, what's his name? Brandon, the head coach in LA. Brandon Staley. You have coaches around the league off that Fangio tree. Fangio's still in the league, I think, as well. He just got a DC job in Miami, right? So, I think that Desai is very exciting. He's young. He's energetic. He's supposedly very detail oriented. I think he could be great at this, but he just hasn't done it yet. So when you're behind Jack Del Rio, Wink Martindale, and Dan Quinn, it's easy to put you 4th when you haven't done it yet.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about him that's exciting is the personnel seems to fit what Fangio wants. I was with Fangio in Chicago, and I guess Desai was like a defensive assistant. I didn't even know that when I was there. So I feel bad.
Defensive quality control coach.
Yeah, so he was in the closet somewhere, typing up cards, and I never saw his face. But I will say the thing about Fangio, like when that system is good, and so basically like high level, the system is basically saying we're going to kind of buck traditional trends and not be +1 in the run game. We're going to rely on our defensive line and our linebackers to be good enough to play you 1-for-1, and then you have +1 with the back. So like with a 7-man blocking surface, most people will play an 8-man kind of run structure so that they can make sure they have one guy for the back. But basically what they're saying now in this Fangio philosophy is we're going to kind of be 1 down as a run team and then +1 in the back end. So that makes sense. That's where everyone's going. I mean, Jack does that a ton now. Like that's one thing. He's kind of cherry picked some of that Fangio stuff. And it's one of the reasons the defense here is so successful. And so when I look at Philly, I look at the personnel there, I'm like, holy cow, do they have the personnel defensively along the defensive line to do that? Because they basically they're asking the guys to play like a gap and a half. They're not true 2-gapping, but they're basically playing like basically from like the head of the center to their gap and then to squeeze down the front side gap. So you got Jordan Davis, maybe the best 2-gapping player the league's seen in the last like 10 years coming out of college. You've got Jalen Carter, you've got Cox, you've got all these kind of big hosses inside. They can for sure do that. Brandon Graham can set a vertical edge like nobody's business. So I definitely think they're going to be in a situation where they'll be able to run. So a lot of teams, like for example, Minnesota did a lot of Vic Fangio stuff last year, but they had some injuries along the defensive line that prevented them from running this gap and a half system. And then it crush them, because then they had to commit more resources to the run. It was a big mess. I don't think that'll be an issue at all in Philadelphia. I think they've got enough really good, like enough high-end horsepower up front that's going to be fine. And if they can detail it up, like it's tough to deal with that defense. They do some really fun stuff in terms of, like this kind of cover 3 match, quarters match type stuff that, again, Jack is doing here that's taken over the league. Like if they can get that done there, they definitely have the personnel to execute that at a high level. So that could be a really, really scary defense with some of that innovation. So
no doubt about it. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulsen. All right, Logan, we did the coordinator rankings, offensive and defensive. We're not going to rank head coaches, which I think probably surprises people because we spend more airtime on the head coaches than we do the coordinators. I would say in mainstream media. I don't know that that's necessarily true on this podcast. I think we probably talk coordinators more than anybody that I've ever heard. But there's a reason for that, right? When you talk about the X's and O's of what actually happens in a game, which is where we spend an inordinate amount of time compared to a lot of people who talk about football, that's who's making those decisions. But I do think it's worth talking about like what makes a good head coach and the impact they do have on the course of a season. And obviously you played for a bunch of different guys in your career and saw different styles, different inputs, guys who were super involved, guys that were not very involved in terms of the details day in, day out. So to you, like what makes a good head coach and what are things that you think head coaches miss at the NFL level?
Yeah, so I think, obviously like they're a CEO basically, like kind of in a traditional form, right? They basically, like if you are a good head coach, you've done a great job hiring a good offensive coordinator and a good DC. And what I mean by that, it's not just X's and O's. You have strong personalities there, right? You've done a good job hiring a good offensive line coach, a good strength coach, because those guys really are going to be your culture builders for your organization. Now, I think there's exceptions to every rule. Like Dan Quinn, when he was the head coach, he was a guy that was the culture builder and was really good at that, but had Kyle as his X's and O's guys. And he really heavily oversaw the defense, right? So like from an X's and O's standpoint, he had two kind of stalwarts at the position that allowed him to focus on that. So I think it's about really first and foremost is making good hires, right? And so like we just talked about the coordinators ad nauseum, like when you are a good head coach, you are good at evaluating talent. You're good at developing talent. In the case of like Philadelphia, for example, like if you're a good head coach, you've had a system in place. So you say, we're going to win football games. We have to know how to replace these guys when they leave. So I think that's part of it. And I think, it's interesting, when we started this talk, one of the things that stuck out to me is like, obviously when I got in, the CEO model was way more prevalent than it is now. Because now you get guys like Kyle who are basically like the OC, and the head coach. And so the way they mitigate that is they have really good people under them from a staff standpoint that allow them to kind of handle the administrative elements, but also be on that side of the football. I think when you look around the division, you get Dayball, who's helping out at offense. You get Mike McCarthy, who's helping out at offense. And you get Shane Steichen, who's helping out on offense. And I do think on some level that model might be becoming more effective than the CEO model. And what I mean by that is that it just keeps that coach in the fight a little bit more. Because a lot of times when they become the head coach, there's so many other things to worry about. You lose the minutia, you lose the X's and O's, you lose the detail. And we talked about how important that detail is. So, with regards to like the head coaches in the division, I think it's no accident that a lot of them are from the offensive side of the football. And a lot of them are still helping kind of on that side of the ball, kind of, maximize that position group. So.
Yeah, Sirianni obviously in Philly, Steichen now in Indy, but same concept for both of them. They will be involved on their side of the ball. I think the other thing too along those lines is like that's why you got hired in the first place. Like Kyle Shanahan didn't get hired because he was going to be an awesome CEO and everyone knew it. He got hired because he's the best offensive mind in the sport. Right. And so I think I talked with Sean about this and when he was here and, was looking to the future and, it definitely has been a topic of conversation amongst these coaches. It's like, if I'm as good at this as everyone says I am and the results say I am, why would I stop doing it? Right. Hey, the best asset I have if I'm Kyle Shanahan is my ability to scheme and call plays. So now that I'm in charge, I'm going to not do that. Right. Like that's just dumb. And so it does involve hiring, whether it's a chief of staff or like an assistant head coach or like some other person to take care of some of the things that you will not have time to do that like a Ron Rivera perhaps might. But there's no rules that says it has to be done a certain way. And to me, like that's what makes a good head coach. Is in some ways it's the same. Like, are you detail oriented? Do you understand your strengths? Do you know how
Yeah.
to cover for your
Yeah.
weaknesses? It's just what that is different when you're a schematic type of person in a schematic role versus kind of an overseer. I think the biggest thing for a head coach and there's two big things that are different as a head coach. One is understanding the locker room and like personnel management on a human level, right? And this is where Rivera is notoriously good, where he understands his locker room and who needs to be pushed and who needs to be cuddled, and are things getting out of hand? Do I let the players take care of this? That's where he's kind of made his hay over the course of years, and why I think a lot of players have had a lot of respect for how he handles business. The other thing is where Rivera, I think, has struggled, to be frank, which is game management. Like someone's got to call the timeouts. Someone's got to do the challenges. Someone's got to kind of have a feel of when to put the foot down on the gas and when to park the bus. Like those game managements around time, score, and situation that ultimately come down to someone making a decision are most often made by the head coach. And that can win or lose you games. You can do all the other stuff, make great hires, have those coordinators have a good game plan. You can have the right people in place. And if you make the wrong decision in the heat of the battle, you can blow the game. And that to me is like the last part of it. And that's really, really hard to kind of practice. I mean, frankly, Belichick's been bad at that at times in his career, of when to go for it on fourth down, for instance. And it's becoming, I would say, a little bit easier with some of the analytics because you can kind of follow them and generally be right. But as I remember having a conversation with Sean about, the analytics might say to go for it on fourth down. And this obviously when he was here, not in LA, where now he coaches Aaron Donald. But if I'm on my backup, if it's 4th and 1 and the analytics say to go for it, but my left guard is out and Aaron Donald's on the other side, the 70 or 60% is not the same 70 or 60% that it would be if I had my starter and that wasn't Aaron Donald. And so that decision-making ability in game is kind of the last piece that's really hard to judge for head coaches. And frankly, it's hard to practice because, when does that come up in practice? Everything's scripted. You have to be in the game to do it and learn from those experiences and hope you're learning from doing it right and not from a bunch of mistakes, because otherwise you won't have that long of a leash to make more.
I agree. And I think, the challenge thing is probably overblown a little bit. Like this, I totally agree with the fourth down thing. I totally agree with that. That is becoming so critical in today's NFL, like stealing possessions, finding ways to maximize that stuff. I think that's, the end of game management, timeouts probably more important also in terms of clock management.
To me, that goes into the challenge stuff, right?
Yeah,
it's like, if you blow a timeout because you listened to a player who was adamant about something that he was wrong about, as opposed to going through your process or having a good process in place, and all of a sudden you're end of game and you don't have that timeout, like your challenge really screwed you up.
Yeah, I agree. And the only reason I bring that up is because I think like people don't understand, like when you're on the sideline, like you're waiting for the TV angle. And it's like, does the TV angle capture something that the player who came off the sideline said, I caught it. Does it capture that? And so like you're negotiating something in real time that I don't love that like as a metric for coaches, but the other stuff I totally agree with. I think end of game management, fourth down decisions, that type of stuff is huge. And so what I will say this is like, Ron has not been, according to you, I don't do enough research on this to know for a fact whether it's good or bad compared to the rest of the league. So I'll defer to you on this. But what I will say is that one of the things I love about the EB hire for Ron is that it fills in this gap that he's had, right? Like he's got two guys now that allow him to do what he's excellent at. And I think that is so valuable. So instead of kind of having to micromanage Scott like he did last year, he doesn't have to worry about EB. EB's going to do what EB does. He is such a good leader and has such a good vision for the offense. It allows him to kind of maybe invest more time into some of the stuff we're talking about. And that's like when you are the head coach in that CEO capacity, that culture building capacity, you need to make sure you've got two guys there that let you do what you are good at. And I think now he's got that. And so, I think maybe, I don't know for sure, but I think maybe there's an improvement in that area for Ron. And I think, like it's so funny. Like I think you look at McCarthy in Dallas, I think that offense is going to struggle because he hasn't called plays in a while, right? And like you lose a little bit of that frostiness. And we mentioned the sounding board with Schottenheimer, how that's going to be really hard for him, right? But then you look at Dayball, Kafka, that great relationship there. Wink, who is going to handle that defense emphatically, right? He could be a head coach. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the kind of leader that you got there. And then I think you look at Philly, and Sirianni's in a tough spot because he's got two young guys there. So how charismatic, how do they handle their stuff? How much oversight is he going to need to provide? And does that detract from his ability to make those excellent fourth down decisions and excellent end of game management type stuff, because he's more worried about other stuff? So that's why I think the coordinator hires are so important, because you got, like, one of the things I love about Sean when he went to LA is he knew he was going to be helping on the offensive side of the football. He was going to be the offensive coordinator, basically.
So he hired Wade Phillips.
And so that just, I don't need to worry about that at all. Like, Wade's going to handle that. I can maybe step in on a meeting if I want to learn something, but those hires are so important. And that's one of the reasons, another reason why I'm so excited about this EB thing, because that's a dude who's ready to be a head coach, and he's just handling one side of the football for you. So now I don't need to worry about the offense. Jack's got the defense. I can worry about culture and then the stuff I got to worry about. So that's why I think that coordinator hiring and that decision is so important.
Yeah, Ron, I asked Ron about that during the spring, and I was like, so what do you do now, basically? And he's like, one of the things that I haven't been able to do as much that I'm really looking forward to is mentoring some of our younger coaches and, like, coaching our coaches.
Right.
And so that's going to make everybody better, because now all of a sudden how you treat those coaches infiltrates, or, filters down into how they coach their position. That raises them. It raises those players. So that's a really good thing. And I think it's something that they've struggled with here, because he has not had these, like, young, bright coaches that are future head coaches on staff. And part of that is a lack of development from the coaches. Right. Now he's got EB, who we think is a future head coach, but, like, Tavita Pritchard, is Ron going to be able to work with him and help mold him into a future head coach? So I think that's something I'm excited to see this year, and check in with Ron a couple times perhaps and see how all of that is going. Last thing I'll ask you about the head coaching position is this: how does it change when it's a young, or I shouldn't need to say young versus old, inexperienced versus experienced, and specifically in one place, right? Like someone who is a first-year head coach in a place and is trying to build the culture and establish things, versus someone, say, in Rivera's spot, where you're 4 years in, you have your people in place, you have your systems, you know where everything is, and you are much more in a management role because you've had a chance to set some of the things in place that a first-year head coach is still setting.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about an established coach versus a new coach is that there's a novelty to a new coach that keeps it exciting and keeps it fresh. So as an older coach, or as someone who's been around for a while, like, how do you keep it relevant? How do you keep the guys dialed in? How do you keep the team focused? I think those are things. Yes, engaging. Thank you. I think that to me is the biggest thing. Like, because when I'd go to places, like I was on 4 teams my last 4 years in the NFL. And you'd come, like, the Bears are a good example. Fox had been there for 3 or 4 years. You could tell everyone in the building, players wise, was kind of like, they didn't dislike Fox, but his message had kind of run thin. It had been the same thing for 3 years. There had been no change, and it felt kind of stale. And I think, like, that's something that can be really challenging. Is how do you keep motivating guys? And, like, Belichick does that through fear. Just absolute terror. And that's one way to do it.
Do your job or you're out of here.
Yeah. Pete Carroll does it by, having a fun, competitive, kind of gamified work environment. So there's different ways to get it done, and there's no right or wrong way. But what is that way for you? And I think, with Rivera, I think bringing in EB and bringing in that big personality is something that keeps it very, very spicy. It brings up the level of competition on the offense, but it also makes practice a little bit spicier, because, like, I think Ron said this during OTAs, and I totally agree with this. Like, your offense kind of sets the tempo for you, And so, like, if your offense is flat, your defense is going to be flat. But if your offense is up, and I think, going to practice, like, people are going to kind of adopt that personality of EB. It's like they're going to talk a little bit of smack. They're going to be yelling. They're going to be loud. They're going to be detailed. They're going to be competitive. That's going to bring the defense up a little bit, and that's what makes a good football team. So I think Ron, having been around for a while, has kept it with this hire. That's why this hire is so important. Like, we talk about the X's and O's, but from a culture standpoint, from a Ron standpoint, it's so important. So I think that's one way to do it. And when you're young, everything is new. You're exciting. You're fresh. It's the new flavor of ice cream. Everyone's excited to be around. Everyone's a little bit nervous about keeping their job. Everyone's worried about the change. But I think that kind of, it inspires some type of motivation in a different way. So I think those are kind of the two challenges as I see them from my experience playing.
Yeah, definitely. All right. That's Logan Paulson, 10 years in the NFL. I'm Craig Hoffman, of course, covered the league for almost that long at this point. With 5 of them as a beat reporter. I know, I'm getting old. It happens to the best of us. Happens to all of us. So if you like what you just heard from that experience and how we speak about it and how we apply it to today's game, and you're new to the show, subscribe. That can be on Apple Podcasts, can be on Spotify if you're watching on YouTube. And then if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that like button as well, so other people know, like, hey, this is good. You should watch this here. And then we'll do it again twice next week. We got some really cool stuff planned. So make sure you stay tuned. We'll be tweeting out about it once it's all locked down, but we're working on a couple of things. Got a couple of irons in the fire, as they say. So we'll see you next week right back here on Take Command. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.